The lab technician's voice cracked slightly when she called. Miss Chen, we need to discuss your recent employment screening results. There's been an anomaly that we've never encountered before. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, standing in the break room of Henderson Marketing Solutions where I'd worked for the past 2 years. What kind of anomaly? The pause stretched longer than it should have. Your sample tested positive for pregnancy hormones, testosterone blockers, and what appears to be veterinary medication typically used for livestock deworming. The levels suggest you'd need to be simultaneously pregnant, transitioning, and, well, a farm animal. We're going to need you to come in for a retest immediately. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My knees nearly gave out. I wasn't pregnant, I wasn't on any hormone therapy, and I definitely wasn't livestock. But I knew exactly whose sample they'd actually tested. The sample that was supposed to be mine had been swapped, and the person responsible had just made the biggest mistake of their career. My name is Chen, and I'm a digital marketing coordinator who just discovered that my boss tried to sabotage my career by switching my drug test sample. What he didn't count on was that his pregnant, transitioning brother-in-law who works on a cattle ranch had provided the replacement sample. This is the story of how one impossible lab result brought down a workplace bully and changed everything. The trouble started long before any drug test was ever mentioned. I'd been working at Henderson Marketing Solutions since graduating with my communications degree 2 years ago. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and gave me experience in digital campaign management. The company handled mid-tier clients, mostly local businesses and a few regional chains. Nothing glamorous, but stable work in a decent office downtown. Mark Henderson was the kind of boss who made you question whether you believed in karma. He'd inherited the company from his father and ran it like his personal kingdom. On paper, Henderson Marketing had 12 employees. In reality, it was Mark's show, and the rest of us were just supporting cast members who better not forget our place. I learned this within my first month. I'd been hired as a junior marketing assistant, but quickly found myself handling tasks way above my pay grade. I'd create entire campaign strategies, write copy, manage client communications, and track analytics. Meanwhile, Mark would swoop in during client meetings, present my work as his own creative vision, and take full credit when campaigns performed well. When things went poorly, suddenly it was all about my execution failing his brilliant strategy. I watched him do this to other employees too. Sarah, our graphic designer, would spend weeks perfecting visual concepts only to have Mark present them as collaborative efforts where he'd provided the artistic direction. James, in accounting, would build detailed financial projections that Mark would claim as his own analytical insights during board meetings. The pattern was consistent and demoralizing. Mark had this way of making you feel like you should be grateful for the opportunity to let him steal your work. He'd frame it as learning experiences, as chances for us to contribute to something bigger than ourselves, as if watching him get promoted and praised for our efforts was somehow beneficial to our professional development. But Mark's ego wasn't his only problem. He had this weird obsession with control that went beyond normal management oversight. He'd time our lunch breaks and comment if we were 5 minutes over. He'd walk by our desks and peer over our shoulders at our computer screens, not to help or provide guidance, but to make sure we weren't browsing anything personal. He installed monitoring software on all our computers and would send passive-aggressive emails about productivity if anyone's activity levels dipped during the day. The micromanagement extended to our personal lives too. Mark expected to be included in our social media connections. He'd scroll through our Instagram posts and make comments about our weekend activities during Monday morning meetings. If someone posted about being out late, he'd make jokes about hoping they were well-rested enough to be productive. It felt invasive and weird, but everyone just went along with it because jobs weren't exactly easy to find. Things escalated about 6 months into my employment when I started getting better at my job. My campaigns were consistently outperforming benchmarks, and clients were specifically asking to work with me. That should have been a good thing. Instead, it made Mark uncomfortable. He began assigning me to the most difficult clients, the ones with impossible deadlines and constantly changing requirements. When I managed to succeed anyway, he'd minimize the achievements or find ways to make them seem less impressive. The real turning point came last spring when I landed our biggest client to date. Riverside Regional Medical Center needed a complete digital marketing overhaul. Their previous agency had botched a campaign so badly that their online reputation was in shambles. They were hemorrhaging patients to competitors and desperately needed someone to turn things around. I'd been working on their proposal for weeks, staying late every night to research their industry, analyze their competition, and develop a comprehensive strategy. I put together demographic studies, platform recommendations, content calendars, and detailed ROI projections. It was easily the most thorough proposal I'd ever created, and I was proud of the work. The presentation meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Mark told me I'd be presenting since I'd done the research and knew the materials best. I practiced my presentation over and over, anticipating questions and preparing responses. I even bought a new outfit because I wanted to look as professional as possible. Wednesday evening, Mark called me into his office. "Actually, Maya, I've been thinking about tomorrow's presentation. This is such a big opportunity for the company that I should probably take the lead. You understand, right? Riverside needs to see that our senior leadership is personally invested in their success." I felt my stomach drop. "But I developed the entire strategy. I know every detail of the proposal." "And you did great work," he said, with that patronizing smile he'd perfected. "That's exactly why I want to present it. Your research deserves to be delivered by someone with the authority to make executive decisions on the spot. Think of it as me amplifying your efforts." There was nothing I could say. He was the owner. He made the decisions. I handed over my presentation materials and watched him review them like he was seeing them for the first time, which he basically was. The next morning, I sat in the conference room while Mark presented my months of work to the Riverside executives. He spoke confidently about market analysis he hadn't conducted, recommended strategies he hadn't developed, and fielded questions about research he hadn't done. When they asked about specific implementation details, he'd glance at me and say things like, "Maya will be handling the day-to-day execution under my supervision." We got the contract. It was the largest deal in the company's history. Mark celebrated by taking the leadership team out for an expensive lunch while the rest of us stayed behind to answer phones. When the local business journal ran an article about the contract, Mark was quoted extensively about his innovative approach to healthcare marketing. My name wasn't mentioned once. That's when I realized I needed to start documenting everything. I began keeping detailed records of my work, saving drafts of campaigns with timestamps, and taking screenshots of my contributions before Mark could claim them. I started building a portfolio of evidence that proved what I was actually accomplishing versus what Mark was taking credit for. The Riverside campaign was a massive success. Patient inquiries increased by 340% in the first 3 months. Their online reputation scores improved dramatically. They were booking procedures at rates they hadn't seen in years. The medical center's marketing director sent glowing emails about how our strategies had transformed their business. Mark forwarded those emails to the entire company with subject lines like, "Another win for Henderson Marketing," and "What happens when we put our best foot forward." He scheduled a company-wide meeting to discuss the campaign's success, presenting himself as the strategic mastermind behind every decision. I sat in that meeting listening to him describe my work as his vision and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about taking credit anymore. This was about completely erasing my contributions and rewriting the narrative to center himself as the hero. I'd done the work, solved the problems, and delivered the results. But according to Mark's version of events, I was barely a footnote in his success story. The worst part was watching my coworkers nod along. They knew who had actually worked on the campaign. They'd seen me staying late, heard me on calls with the client, and helped me troubleshoot issues. But when Mark spoke, they just accepted his version of reality because challenging him wasn't worth the risk to their own jobs. After the meeting, I started looking for other opportunities. I updated my resume, highlighting the Riverside success story with specific metrics and outcomes. I began reaching out to contacts in the industry and exploring openings at larger agencies where my work might be valued appropriately.
That's when Mark announced the drug testing policy. It came up during a regular Monday morning staff meeting about 2 months after the Riverside celebration. Mark stood at the front of the conference room with a stack of papers, looking more serious than usual. "I've been consulting with our legal team about implementing some new workplace policies to ensure we're maintaining the highest professional standards," he began. "Effective immediately, all employees will be subject to random drug and alcohol testing. This isn't because we suspect anyone of anything, it's about protecting the company and our clients from potential liability issues. Some of our bigger clients are starting to require proof that their agency partners maintain drug-free workplaces." Sarah raised her hand. "Random testing? What does that mean exactly?" "It means anyone can be selected for testing at any time, with little to no advance notice. The testing will be conducted by an accredited laboratory, and any positive results will result in immediate termination." The room fell silent. We all knew this was unusual for a marketing agency. Drug testing was common in manufacturing, healthcare, or transportation, but advertising and marketing companies typically didn't bother unless there was a specific incident or legal requirement. James from accounting spoke up. "Is this because of a client requirement? Which clients are asking for this?" Mark's jaw tightened slightly. "It's a proactive measure to position us competitively. Several potential clients have mentioned that they prefer working with agencies that demonstrate their commitment to professionalism through comprehensive workplace policies." That sounded like corporate speak for, "I made this up." But nobody was going to challenge him directly. We all just nodded and accepted that this was our new reality. What Mark didn't mention was that the testing wouldn't actually be random. I found that out later when I overheard him on a phone call with someone from the testing company. He was asking about procedures for targeted testing and whether there were ways to ensure specific employees were selected for screening. The pieces started falling into place. Mark knew I was looking for other jobs. He'd probably seen me updating my LinkedIn profile or noticed that I was being more careful about what projects I took on. The drug testing policy wasn't about company standards or client requirements. It was about finding a way to get rid of employees he saw as potential threats. I'd never done drugs in my life. I barely drank alcohol and had never even smoked marijuana. I took prescription medication for anxiety, but that was legal and documented with my doctor. There was no way I'd fail a legitimate drug test. But legitimate was the key word. If Mark was planning targeted testing, who knew what else he might be planning? I started paying closer attention to his behavior around the office. He'd always been controlling, but now there was something different. He seemed more focused on me specifically, finding reasons to question my work or challenge my decisions. He'd assign me projects with impossible deadlines, then act disappointed when I couldn't deliver miracles. During team meetings, he'd ask pointed questions about my campaigns, looking for any mistake or oversight he could use against me. When I delivered error-free work, he'd move the goalposts or change the requirements after the fact. It felt like he was building a case for something. The first random drug test came 3 weeks after the policy announcement. Mark called me into his office on a Friday afternoon and handed me a sealed envelope. "Congratulations, Maya. You've been selected for our first round of testing. You'll need to report to MedScreen Labs by 5 o'clock today." 5 o'clock on a Friday. Just enough time to drive across town and complete the test before the weekend, but not enough time to prepare if I'd actually been using something. The timing felt deliberate. "Is there anything you need to tell me before you go?" Mark asked, watching my face carefully. "Like what? Any prescription medications, supplements, anything that might show up in the screening?" I listed my anxiety medication and a vitamin D supplement my doctor had recommended. Both were completely legal and documented. Mark made notes on a legal pad like he was conducting an investigation. "Good," he said. "I'm sure everything will be fine. Just remember that any positive result, even for prescription drugs that aren't properly disclosed, can result in immediate termination." That was news to me. The policy he'd announced specifically said prescription medications were acceptable with proper documentation. Now he was suggesting that even disclosed prescriptions could be grounds for firing. The rules were changing in real time, and they all seemed designed to give him maximum flexibility to get rid of anyone he wanted gone. I drove to MedScreen Labs feeling anxious but confident. I had nothing to hide. My prescription was legal and documented. I'd never used recreational drugs. The test would come back clean, and Mark would have to find some other way to harass me. The lab was in a sterile office building near the airport. I signed in at the front desk and was directed to a small waiting room with motivational posters about making healthy choices. The whole place smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. When my name was called, I followed a technician down a hallway to a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a locked cabinet. She explained the procedure, had me sign consent forms, and handed me a plastic specimen cup with my name and employee ID number written on a label. The bathroom was down the hall. Standard procedure: no running water, blue dye in the toilet, temperature strip on the cup to ensure the sample was fresh. I completed the collection, sealed the container, and returned it to the technician.
She verified the temperature, checked the specimen against my ID, and placed it in a secure transport bag. Results should be available to your employer within 48 to 72 hours, she explained. If there are any issues with the sample, we'll contact you directly. I left the lab feeling relieved. Whatever Mark was planning, this wasn't going to be the tool he used against me. I spent the weekend working on job applications and preparing for interviews. If he wanted me gone, I'd find somewhere better to go. Monday morning, Mark seemed unusually cheerful. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and asked how my weekend had been. Get any interesting phone calls? He added, like he was expecting something specific. No, I said. Should I have? No, just wondering. Sometimes the lab calls if there are questions about test results. That seemed odd. The technician had said they'd contact my employer, not me, unless there was a problem with the sample itself. Why would Mark expect the lab to call me? Tuesday passed without any mention of test results. Wednesday morning, Mark called a staff meeting to discuss recent developments, but didn't elaborate on what those developments might be. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Wednesday evening, I got the call that changed everything. Miss Chen, this is Patricia Wong from MedScreen Labs. We need to discuss your recent employment screening results. There's been an anomaly that we've never encountered before. That's when she told me about the pregnancy hormones, testosterone blockers, and livestock deworming medication. That's when I realized Mark's plan had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real story was just beginning. After hanging up with Patricia from the lab, I sat in my car outside my apartment building for 20 minutes, trying to process what I just heard. Pregnancy hormones, testosterone blockers, and livestock deworming medication. The combination was so bizarre that it would have been funny if it wasn't my career on the line. But the more I thought about it, the more pieces started clicking into place. Mark had been so confident that this drug test would solve his Maya problem. He'd been practically gleeful when he handed me that envelope on Friday, like he already knew what the results would show. The timing, the pressure, the way he'd asked if I expected any phone calls, none of that made sense if this was actually a random screening. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia back. I need to understand something, I said when she answered. You mentioned that you've never seen results like this before. What exactly does that mean? Well, she paused, like she was trying to figure out how much detail to share. In 15 years of conducting employment screenings, I've never had a sample that tested positive for such a contradictory combination of substances. The hormone levels alone suggest someone who would need to be receiving multiple types of medical treatment simultaneously. And the veterinary medication, that's not something we typically see in human samples. Is it possible that samples could have been mixed up or switched somehow? Another pause, longer this time. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you directly. Our chain of custody procedures are very strict, but these results are so unusual that we're questioning whether there might have been some kind of error in the collection or handling process. My pulse quickened. What kind of error? I can't speculate about specifics over the phone, but we'd like you to come in for a supervised retest as soon as possible. If there was any compromise to the original sample, a new test under controlled conditions should clarify things. I scheduled the retest for the next morning and spent the evening thinking through everything I knew about Mark's behavior over the past few weeks. He'd been so confident about this drug testing policy, like he had inside information about how it would play out. He'd specifically asked me about prescription medications, almost like he was fishing for something he could use against me later. But if he'd somehow tampered with my sample,
Where would he have gotten a replacement? And why would that replacement contain such a weird combination of substances? The answer came to me around midnight. Mark's brother-in-law, Danny. I'd met Danny a few times at company events. He worked on a cattle ranch outside the city and was going through some kind of gender transition. Mark had mentioned it in passing a few months ago, not in a supportive way, but in his typical gossip-spreading fashion. He'd also mentioned that Danny's wife was pregnant with their second child. If someone was taking testosterone blockers as part of transitioning, living with someone who was pregnant, and working around livestock that needed regular deworming treatments, they could easily be exposed to all three types of substances that showed up in my test. But how would Mark have gotten access to Danny's urine? And more importantly, how would he have switched it with mine at the lab? I spent the rest of the night researching MedScreen Labs online. Their website emphasized their security protocols and chain of custody procedures. Every sample was supposed to be labeled, sealed, and tracked from collection to analysis. Tampering with samples was a federal crime that could result in massive fines and prison time. But I also found something interesting in their staff directory. Under laboratory technicians, there was a photo of someone who looked familiar. Tony Brennan had worked at MedScreen for 3 years and specialized in employment screening protocols. Tony Brennan also happened to be Mark's college roommate. I'd heard Mark mention Tony before, usually in the context of their weekend fishing trips or fantasy football league. I'd never made the connection between Tony the fishing buddy and Tony the lab technician, but now it seemed like more than a coincidence. The next morning, I arrived at MedScreen 30 minutes early for my retest appointment. I wanted time to observe the facility and see if I could learn more about their procedures. The same receptionist was working, and she seemed surprised to see me back so soon. "Miss Chen, I wasn't expecting you until next week. Did you need to reschedule something?" That was odd. According to Patricia, my retest was scheduled for this morning, but the receptionist was acting like she thought I had a different appointment. "I'm here for my retest," I explained. "Patricia Wong called me yesterday about unusual results." The receptionist frowned and checked her computer. "I don't see Patricia Wong in our directory."
Are you sure you spoke with someone from our lab? My stomach dropped. She said she was from MedScreen Labs. She knew about my test results and said I needed to come in for a supervised retest. Let me check with our supervisor. The receptionist picked up her phone and had a quiet conversation with someone in the back office. After a few minutes, she hung up and looked even more confused. Our supervisor says we haven't released any results for your test yet. They're still being processed. And we don't have anyone named Patricia Wong on staff. I felt like the ground was shifting under my feet. If Patricia Wong didn't work at MedScreen, who had called me? And how did they know about the pregnancy hormones, testosterone blockers, and livestock medication? "Can I speak with your supervisor directly?" I asked. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman in a lab coat emerged from the back office. She introduced herself as Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the facility director. "I understand there's been some confusion about your test results?" I explained the phone call from Patricia Wong and the bizarre combination of substances she'd described. Dr. Martinez listened carefully, taking notes on a clipboard. "This is very concerning," she said when I finished. "First, we would never release preliminary results over the phone to an employee. All results go directly to the employer through secure channels. Second, your sample is still being processed and won't be ready until tomorrow at the earliest. So someone who doesn't work here called me with fake results? It appears that way. Do you have any idea who might have access to information about what your actual results would show?" I thought about Tony Brennan. If he worked here and was friends with Mark, he could potentially access my sample or information about the testing process. But I didn't want to make accusations without proof. "Is there any way someone could have tampered with my original sample?" I asked. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable. "Our security protocols are designed to prevent that kind of interference. But if you have specific concerns about the integrity of your test, I'd be happy to review our procedures with you." She led me to a small conference room and pulled out a thick binder of policies and procedures. The chain of custody documentation was extensive. Every sample was supposed to be photographed, labeled with unique identifiers, sealed in tamper-evident containers, and tracked through a computerized system that logged every person who handled it.
Can I see the documentation for my specific sample? I asked. Dr. Martinez hesitated. That information is confidential and typically only shared with employers or legal representatives. But if someone tampered with my sample, wouldn't that documentation show irregularities? Potentially, yes. If you suspect tampering, you can file a formal complaint and request an investigation. That would involve reviewing all handling procedures and interviewing everyone who had contact with your sample. I decided to file the complaint. Dr. Martinez provided me with forms to complete and explained that the investigation could take several weeks. In the meantime, she offered to conduct a new test under enhanced security protocols. We can do a supervised collection with multiple witnesses and additional documentation. If someone has been interfering with our normal procedures, enhanced protocols should prevent any future tampering. I agreed to the supervised retest and scheduled it for the following day. But I also had another plan forming in my mind. If Mark and Tony were working together to sabotage my drug test, they probably thought their scheme had worked perfectly. Mark was expecting me to fail the test and lose my job. He had no idea that I'd already discovered the fraud. That gave me an advantage. Instead of confronting him directly, I could let him think his plan was succeeding while I gathered evidence to expose what he'd actually done. I drove back to the office and acted like nothing unusual had happened. When Mark asked how my morning had gone, I just shrugged and said I'd had some errands to run. He seemed disappointed that I wasn't more stressed or worried. Around lunchtime, he called me into his office with that same smug expression he'd worn when he assigned me the drug test. "Maya, I need to discuss something sensitive with you. I got a call from the testing lab this morning about your screening results." My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Oh, what did they say?" "I'm afraid the results weren't what we hoped for. It appears you tested positive for several controlled substances." I let my face fall, like I was shocked and devastated by this news. "That's impossible. I don't use drugs. There must be some mistake." Mark shook his head with fake sympathy. "I know this is hard to hear, but the lab results are very clear. They found evidence of multiple illegal substances in your system. This puts me in a very difficult position." "What kind of substances?" I asked, curious to see if his version would match the fake call I'd received. "The lab didn't provide specific details, just that you tested positive for controlled substances that are incompatible with workplace safety standards." Interesting. He wasn't mentioning the pregnancy hormones, testosterone blockers, or livestock medication. Either he didn't know those details, or he was being deliberately vague to avoid questions about how such an unusual combination could be possible. "Can I see the results?" I asked. "I want to understand what happened." "The lab report is confidential, employer property. But Maya, I want you to know that I'm not judging you. Addiction is a disease, and there are resources available to help people in your situation." He was already framing this as if I had admitted to having a drug problem. The manipulation was breathtaking in its efficiency. "I don't have an addiction," I said firmly. "I've never used illegal drugs in my life. Something is wrong with this test."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mark leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. I understand denial is a common reaction to this kind of news, but we have to deal with the reality of the situation. Company policy requires immediate termination for positive drug tests. I want to request a retest. If there was a mistake with the first test, a second test should clear things up. Unfortunately, our policy doesn't allow for retesting. The lab's procedures are very thorough, and their results are definitive. Of course they were. Mark had probably made sure that the company policy didn't include provisions for appeals or retesting. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Can we discuss next steps tomorrow?" Mark's expression tightened slightly. He was probably hoping I'd break down and quit on the spot, saving him the trouble of going through a formal termination process. "I suppose we can wait until tomorrow," he said reluctantly. "But Maya, I want you to understand that this situation isn't going to change. The test results are what they are." I nodded and left his office, making sure to look appropriately devastated. But inside, I was furious. Mark had just lied to my face about receiving lab results that didn't exist.
He was prepared to fire me based on a fake drug test that someone had fabricated specifically to get rid of me. The rest of the afternoon, I focused on documenting everything. I wrote down the exact words Mark had used when he told me about the lab results. I noted the time of our conversation and his refusal to show me the actual report. I also started looking more carefully at his interactions with other employees. Around 4 o'clock, I overheard Mark on a phone call in his office. The door was partially open, and his voice carried into the hallway. "Yeah, it worked perfectly," he was saying. "She bought it completely. I told her the test came back positive, and she didn't even question it." I moved closer to the doorway, pretending to organize files at the copy machine. No, I didn't give her specifics, just said controlled substances. She asked for a retest, but I told her company policy doesn't allow it. There was a pause while the other person spoke. "Tomorrow morning, I'll make it official and have her clean out her desk. Then we can move forward with hiring someone more manageable." Another pause. "Trust me, there's no way this comes back to bite us. The whole thing looks completely legitimate." Mark laughed at something the other person said, then lowered his voice. "I owe you big time for this, Tony. Dinner's on me next weekend." Tony? I'd been right about the connection to Tony Brennan at the lab. Mark was literally talking to his co-conspirator about how well their scheme had worked. I quickly returned to my desk and grabbed my phone. I opened the voice recording app and started a new recording, then walked back toward Mark's office. The conversation was winding down, but I caught the end of it. "Just make sure you delete anything that could connect us to this," Mark was saying. "And remember, if anyone asks, you never spoke to me about Maya's test." Perfect. I had him on tape admitting to a conspiracy and instructing his accomplice to destroy evidence. After Mark hung up, I went back to my desk and saved the recording to a secure cloud storage account. Then I made copies and emailed them to my personal account using an encrypted service. If Mark thought he was covering his tracks, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. The next morning, I arrived at work early and went straight to HR. Henderson Marketing Solutions didn't have a dedicated HR department, just a part-time consultant named Beverly who came in twice a week to handle payroll and employee issues. Fortunately, Thursday was one of her regular days. Beverly had always struck me as someone who took compliance seriously. She was probably in her 60s, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every workplace drama imaginable. When I knocked on her temporary office door, she looked up from a stack of timesheets and smiled. "Maya, good morning. What can I help you with?" I sat down across from her desk and pulled out my phone. "I need to report a serious violation of employment law. My supervisor has fabricated drug test results and is planning to terminate me based on fraudulent evidence." Beverly's expression shifted from friendly to concerned. "That's a very serious accusation. Can you walk me through what happened?" I started with Mark's announcement of the drug testing policy and his decision to randomly select me for the first test. I explained about the fake call from someone claiming to be from the lab, the impossible combination of substances they described, and my discovery that no such person worked at MedScreen. Then I played the recording of Mark's phone conversation with Tony, where he admitted that it worked perfectly and discussed making my termination official. Beverly listened to the entire recording twice, taking detailed notes. Her expression grew more serious with each detail. "Maya, if what you're telling me is accurate, this represents multiple serious crimes. Conspiracy to commit fraud, tampering with drug test results, potential violation of federal employment law. This goes far beyond typical workplace issues." "I know. That's why I'm bringing it to you instead of trying to handle it myself. I need this documented properly so there's an official record of what happened." Beverly nodded and pulled out a thick file folder. "I'm going to need you to write a detailed statement about everything you've experienced. Include dates, times, names, and any other relevant details. I'll also need copies of any evidence you've collected." I spent the next hour writing out my statement while Beverly made phone calls. I could hear her speaking with someone about employment law violations and requesting guidance on proper procedures for reporting suspected fraud. When I finished my statement, Beverly reviewed it carefully and asked several follow-up questions. She wanted to make sure she understood the timeline correctly and had accurate information about all the people involved. "The next step is to contact MedScreen Labs directly and request a formal investigation into their testing procedures," she said. If someone who works there has been tampering with samples, that's a federal crime that needs to be reported to appropriate authorities. I already filed a complaint with their facility director yesterday. They're conducting their own investigation.
Good. We'll also need to preserve all evidence related to this incident. That includes your phone recordings, any communications from Mark about the drug test, and documentation of the fake call you received. Beverly opened a locked filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Legal Issues. She placed my statement inside and locked the cabinet again. Maya, I want you to know that retaliation for reporting this kind of violation is itself illegal. If Mark tries to fire you or take any adverse action before this investigation is complete, that would constitute additional crimes. What should I do if he calls me into his office today? He told me yesterday that he wanted to discuss next steps about my supposed positive drug test. Beverly thought for a moment. I think you should let him proceed with whatever he was planning. If he formally terminates you based on fraudulent test results, that will provide additional evidence of the conspiracy. Just make sure you document everything he says and does. That sounded risky, but I could see the logic. If Mark fired me based on fake evidence, it would prove that the entire scheme was designed to get rid of me illegally. Will the company support me if this turns into a legal matter? Maya, if what you've described is accurate, the company had no knowledge of Mark's actions. As the owner, he was acting outside his authority and potentially exposing Henderson Marketing to significant liability. The company's interests are aligned with yours in getting to the truth and holding him accountable. I hadn't expected that response, but it made sense. If Mark had been using company resources to commit crimes, the business itself could face legal consequences. Beverly and the other employees were just as much victims of his fraud as I was. Around 10:30, Mark sent me an email requesting a meeting in his office at 11 o'clock. The subject line read, "Employment Status Discussion," which sounded ominous and official. I forwarded the email to Beverly and started my phone recording app before walking to Mark's office. I wanted to capture whatever happened next. Mark was sitting behind his desk with a folder in front of him, and that same fake, sympathetic expression he'd worn yesterday. Maya, please have a seat. I know this is difficult, but we need to finalize your employment status based on yesterday's drug test results. I sat down and tried to look appropriately nervous. Have you heard anything new from the lab? No, the results stand as reported. You tested positive for controlled substances, which violates our workplace safety policy. I'm afraid I have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a termination letter dated today, citing violation of drug-free workplace policy as the reason for dismissal. I'm really sorry it came to this, Maya. You've done good work for us, but we can't compromise on safety issues. I read through the termination letter, noting that it referenced specific lab results that didn't actually exist. Mark had put his fraud in writing and signed it as the company owner. Can I at least see the lab report before I accept this? I asked. I still don't understand how I could have tested positive for anything. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. As I explained yesterday, the lab report is confidential company property, but the results are clear and definitive. If the results are so clear, why won't you show them to me? What are you hiding? I'm not hiding anything, Maya. This is just standard procedure for handling positive drug tests. I pulled out my phone and stopped the recording, then immediately opened my email app. Actually, Mark, I think there's something you need to know. I spoke with MedScreen Labs yesterday, and they told me something very interesting. Mark's expression shifted from fake sympathy to genuine concern. What did they tell you? They told me that my test results haven't been released yet. They're still being processed and won't be available until today at the earliest. They also told me that they don't have any employee named Patricia Wong. The color drained from Mark's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the fake phone calls someone made to me Tuesday night, claiming to be from the lab and describing impossible test results. I'm talking about you lying to me yesterday about receiving results that don't exist.
Mark stood up from his chair, his hands shaking slightly. Maya, I think you're confused about what happened. The lab definitely called me with your results. Really? Then you won't mind if I call them right now and verify that, will you? I dialed MedScreen's main number and put the call on speaker. When the receptionist answered, I asked to speak with Dr. Martinez about the status of my drug test results. Dr. Martinez, this is Maya Chen. I'm here with my employer, and he's claiming that you released my test results to him yesterday. Can you confirm whether that's accurate? Ms. Chen, as I explained to you yesterday, we haven't released any results for your test yet. Our policy requires written authorization before we can discuss results with employers, and we haven't received any such authorization. Mark was staring at the phone like it was a bomb about to explode. Dr. Martinez, my employer is claiming he received a phone call from your lab reporting positive results for controlled substances. Is it possible someone from your facility made such a call? Absolutely not. That would be a serious violation of our procedures and federal privacy laws. If someone claimed to be calling from our lab with your results, they were misrepresenting themselves. I thanked Dr. Martinez and hung up. Mark was still standing behind his desk, but he looked like he was about to collapse. So, Mark, I said, would you like to explain to me how you received lab results that don't exist from a facility that never called you? Mark sank back into his chair, his face pale and sweaty. There must be some confusion. Maybe I spoke with a different lab, or maybe there was a miscommunication about which test we were discussing. What other lab? You specifically told me yesterday that MedScreen had called you about my results, and there is no other test. I've only been tested once, at the facility you assigned. Maya, I think you're blowing this out of proportion. Maybe the lab made a mistake when they spoke with Dr. Martinez. Sometimes these medical facilities have communication issues.
I almost laughed at how desperately he was grasping for explanations. Mark, I also have something else I think you should hear. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of his conversation with Tony. Mark's voice filled the room. Yeah, it worked perfectly. She bought it completely. I told her the test came back positive, and she didn't even question it. Mark's eyes went wide as he heard his own voice admitting to the fraud. When the recording reached the part where he thanked Tony and told him to delete any evidence, Mark lunged for my phone. Turn that off. You can't record private conversations without consent. I pulled the phone away from his reach. Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. Since I was present during your phone call, which took place in a shared workspace where anyone could overhear, I had every right to record it. Mark slumped back in his chair, the fight going out of him. Maya, please, you don't understand the whole situation. There are things going on that you don't know about. Then explain them to me. Start with why you and Tony Brennan conspired to frame me with fake drug test results. How do you know about Tony? Because I actually investigated what happened, instead of just accepting your lies. Tony works at MedScreen Labs, and you've been friends since college. It wasn't hard to connect the dots once I knew what to look for. Mark put his head in his hands. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just needed you to quit quietly. Why? What did I ever do to deserve this? You were becoming a problem. Clients were asking for you specifically. You were getting recognition for campaigns that should have been credited to the company leadership. You were making me look bad. So you decided to destroy my career rather than just manage me differently? I tried other approaches first. I gave you impossible deadlines. I assigned you difficult clients. I made sure your contributions weren't highlighted in company meetings. But nothing worked. You kept succeeding anyway, and it was undermining my authority. The casual way he described his systematic harassment was stunning. He'd been deliberately sabotaging my work environment for months, and he saw nothing wrong with that. So when the harassment didn't work, you escalated to fraud? It was Tony's idea. He said he could make it look like you failed a drug test, and then I could fire you for cause. No wrongful termination lawsuit, no unemployment benefits, just a clean dismissal that would make it hard for you to find another job. And you didn't think there was anything wrong with falsifying medical records and committing federal crimes? Mark looked up at me with genuine confusion. It's not like we were hurting anyone. We were just solving a business problem. I stared at him in disbelief. In his mind, destroying my career and reputation was just a business problem that needed solving. He genuinely didn't understand that what he'd done was wrong. Mark, you do realize that tampering with drug test results is a federal crime, right? You could go to prison for this. Nobody's going to prison. It's your word against mine, and I'm the owner of the company. Actually, it's not my word against yours anymore. I have recordings of you admitting to the conspiracy. I have documentation of your lies about receiving lab results, and I've already reported everything to HR and to MedScreen's facility director. Mark's face went from pale to red. You reported me to Beverly? What did you tell her? Everything. She's the one who advised me to let you proceed with firing me, so we'd have additional evidence of the fraud. Beverly advised you to. Mark stopped mid-sentence, realization dawning on his face. You've been setting me up this entire time? I've been documenting your crimes. There's a difference. Mark stood up again, this time with genuine anger replacing the panic. You little manipulative bitch. You think you're so clever, don't you? I think I'm someone who refuses to let workplace bullies destroy my life. And I think you just made your situation significantly worse by calling me names and making threats. I didn't threaten you. You called me a manipulative bitch in an aggressive tone while standing over me in a closed office. Most employment lawyers would consider that threatening behavior. Mark realized what he'd just done and sat back down. Maya, let's try to work something out. Maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone. What kind of solution? I could withdraw the termination. We could say there was a mistake with the lab results, and you could keep your job. Maybe even get a promotion and a raise. I almost laughed out loud. You want to bribe me to cover up your federal crimes? It's not a bribe. It's a reasonable business arrangement. You get to keep your job and advance your career, and we avoid unnecessary legal complications. The legal complications exist whether I accept your offer or not. You and Tony have already committed multiple crimes. Those don't disappear just because you give me a promotion. But if you don't pursue it, nothing will happen. No prosecutors, no investigations, no problems for anyone. Mark was still trying to manipulate the situation, even after being caught red-handed. He couldn't accept that his actions had consequences that were beyond his control. Mark, even if I wanted to cover this up, which I don't, it's too late. I've already filed formal complaints with HR and with MedScreen. Beverly is required to report suspected criminal activity to authorities. Mark's face went from pale to red. You reported me to Beverly? What did you tell her? Everything. She's the one who advised me to let you proceed with firing me so we'd have additional evidence of the fraud. Beverly advised you to. Mark stopped mid-sentence, realization dawning on his face. You've been setting me up this entire time? I've been documenting your crimes. There's a difference. Mark stood up again, this time with genuine anger replacing the panic. You little manipulative bitch. You think you're so clever, don't you? I think I'm someone who refuses to let workplace bullies destroy my life. And I think you just made your situation significantly worse by calling me names and making threats. I didn't threaten you. You called me a manipulative bitch in an aggressive tone while standing over me in a closed office. Most employment lawyers would consider that threatening behavior. Mark realized what he'd just done and sat back down. Maya, let's try to work something out. Maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone. What kind of solution? I could withdraw the termination. We could say there was a mistake with the lab results, and you could keep your job. Maybe even get a promotion and a raise. I almost laughed out loud. You want to bribe me to cover up your federal crimes? It's not a bribe. It's a reasonable business arrangement. You get to keep your job and advance your career, and we avoid unnecessary legal complications. The legal complications exist whether I accept your offer or not. You and Tony have already committed multiple crimes. Those don't disappear just because you give me a promotion. But if you don't pursue it, nothing will happen. No prosecutors, no investigations, no problems for anyone. Mark was still trying to manipulate the situation, even after being caught red-handed. He couldn't accept that his actions had consequences that were beyond his control. Mark, even if I wanted to cover this up, which I don't, it's too late. I've already filed formal complaints with HR and with MedScreen. Beverly is required to report suspected criminal activity to authorities.
Dr. Martinez is conducting an investigation that will uncover Tony's involvement. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug anymore. You've ruined everything, Mark said quietly. The company, my reputation, Tony's career. All because you couldn't just accept that it was time for you to move on. I ruined everything. You're the one who decided to commit fraud instead of managing employees professionally. You're the one who involved your friend in criminal activity. You're the one who chose to lie and manipulate rather than have honest conversations about workplace issues. Mark didn't respond. He was staring at his desk like he was trying to figure out how his perfect plan had gone so wrong. There's something else you should know, I continued. The real drug test results came back this morning. Mark looked up sharply. What? Dr. Martinez called me an hour ago. My actual test results were negative for all substances except my prescribed anxiety medication, which I had properly disclosed. So even if your scheme had worked, even if you'd successfully framed me, the truth would have come out eventually. That's impossible. Tony said he switched the samples perfectly. He did switch them. That's the problem. Instead of switching my clean sample with a fake positive sample, he switched it with someone else's real sample. Someone who had pregnancy hormones, testosterone blockers, and livestock deworming medication in their system. Mark's eyes widened as he realized what that meant. Danny, your brother-in-law Danny, who works on a cattle ranch, is transitioning with hormone therapy and lives with his pregnant wife. Tony must have used his sample, thinking it would just show as a generic positive result. Instead, it created an impossible combination that immediately raised red flags. How do you know about Danny's situation? Because you've gossiped about his transition and his wife's pregnancy at multiple company events. You gave me all the information I needed to figure out whose sample was actually tested. Mark put his head back in his hands. Tony swore this would work. He said he'd done it before for other employers who needed problem employees removed. That was news to me. He's done this before? A few times. Companies would pay him to make sure certain employees failed their drug tests. It was supposed to be foolproof. So this isn't just about me. Tony has been running a systematic scheme to help employers fire people illegally. I don't know the details. I just know that Tony said he could solve my problem with you. I was recording this entire conversation on my phone, and Mark had just admitted to participating in a broader conspiracy involving multiple victims. This was much bigger than just my situation. Mark, you need to understand something. If Tony has been doing this to other people, that makes this a large-scale criminal enterprise. The FBI investigates this kind of systematic fraud. This isn't going to be handled by local police or employment lawyers. What are you saying? I'm saying that when I report Tony's admission about helping other employers, federal investigators are going to want to know about every instance of sample tampering he's been involved with. They're going to subpoena records from MedScreen going back years. They're going to investigate every employer who might have paid for fake test results. Maya, please, I have a family. I have employees who depend on this company. If this becomes a federal investigation, it will destroy everything. You should have thought about that before you decided to commit federal crimes. Can't we work something out? I'll do anything you want. I'll give you the company if that's what it takes. I stared at him for a moment, trying to process the fact that he was offering to give me ownership of Henderson Marketing Solutions in exchange for covering up his crimes. Mark, you can't bribe your way out of federal crimes. And even if you could, why would I want a company that's about to be investigated for criminal activity? The company didn't do anything wrong. It was just me and Tony. The company employed you and gave you the authority to implement fraudulent drug testing policies. The company resources were used to facilitate the crimes. Any decent lawyer would argue that Henderson Marketing is liable for your actions as owner and CEO. Mark was quiet for several minutes, apparently realizing that his situation was much worse than he'd initially understood. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Now you call Tony and tell him that your plan failed and that he needs to get a lawyer. You also need to contact your own attorney and figure out how to handle the inevitable criminal charges. Are you going to keep working here? I don't know yet. That depends on what Beverly and the company's legal team decide to do about your crimes. What if I resign? What if I step down as owner and CEO? Would that help the situation? It might help the company distance itself from your actions, but it won't eliminate your personal criminal liability." Mark nodded slowly, like he was finally accepting the reality of his situation. "For what it's worth, Maya, I never wanted it to go this far. I thought it would be easier if you just moved on to another job. All you had to do was treat me fairly and professionally. If you'd managed me properly, given me appropriate credit for my work, and addressed any performance issues through normal channels, none of this would have happened. I know that now. Do you? Because even now, you're still talking about this like it was a reasonable business decision that just went wrong. You haven't once acknowledged that what you did was fundamentally wrong, regardless of how it turned out." Mark looked at me for a long moment. "You're right. What I did was wrong. It was criminal, and it was cruel, and I'm sorry." It was the first genuine apology I'd heard from him, though it felt too little, too late. "I appreciate the apology, Mark, but it doesn't change what happens next." "I understand." I stood up from my chair, still holding my phone with the recording app running. "I'm going to go talk with Beverly about next steps. I suggest you use this time to call your attorney and figure out how you want to handle the legal issues." "Maya?" I turned back toward him. "Thank you for not letting me fire you based on fake evidence. If you'd just accepted the termination, I might have kept doing this to other people." It was an odd thing to thank me for, but I supposed he was right. If I hadn't fought back, Tony's scheme would have continued, and other employees would have been framed with fake drug test results. "You're welcome," I said, and walked out of his office. As I headed toward Beverly's temporary office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally out, anger at how far Mark had been willing to go to get rid of me, satisfaction that his plan had backfired so spectacularly, and uncertainty about what would happen next. Beverly was on the phone when I knocked on her door, but she gestured for me to come in and sit down. She was talking to someone about employment law violations and federal reporting requirements. When she hung up, she looked at me with a mixture of concern and admiration. "How did your meeting with Mark go?" He confessed to everything: the fake lab results, the conspiracy with Tony Brennan, even admitted that Tony has done this before for other employers. Beverly's eyebrows went up. He admitted to participating in a broader scheme? He said Tony told him he'd helped other companies remove problem employees by tampering with their drug tests. "Maya, if that's true, this is much bigger than we initially thought. We're talking about systematic fraud that could involve dozens of victims." That's what I told Mark. He's finally starting to understand how serious this is. Beverly pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. "I need you to write down everything Mark said in that meeting, word for word if possible. If this becomes a federal investigation, every detail will be important." "I have something better than notes," I said, holding up my phone. "I recorded the entire conversation." Beverly smiled for the first time since I'd brought this situation to her attention. "Maya, you might just be the most prepared whistleblower I've ever worked with. I've learned to document everything when dealing with workplace bullies." "Well, your documentation skills might help bring down a criminal enterprise that's been victimizing employees for years." As I sat down to write my statement about the morning's events, I realized that this situation had grown far beyond my personal conflict with Mark. What had started as one boss trying to frame one employee had revealed a systematic scheme that threatened the employment rights of workers across multiple companies. But I also realized that I was no longer just a victim. I was someone who had fought back effectively, gathered evidence methodically, and exposed crimes that might have continued indefinitely if I'd simply accepted Mark's lies and moved on quietly. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely proud of the work I was doing. Over the next 3 days, everything moved faster than I could have imagined. Beverly spent most of Thursday afternoon on conference calls with employment lawyers and compliance specialists, trying to understand Henderson Marketing's legal exposure and reporting obligations. By Friday morning, she'd decided that the company needed to take immediate action to distance itself from Mark's criminal behavior. The first step was removing Mark from all operational responsibilities while maintaining the legal fiction that he was still technically the owner. Beverly explained that this would help protect the company's other employees and clients while the investigation proceeded. Mark was essentially placed on unpaid administrative leave, stripped of access to company systems, and prohibited from making any business decisions. Sarah from graphic design was promoted to interim operations manager, and James from accounting took over financial oversight. Beverly brought in a temporary CEO consultant to handle day-to-day leadership until the legal situation resolved. It was surreal watching the company reorganize itself around Mark's sudden absence, but everyone seemed relieved that he was no longer making decisions that could further jeopardize their jobs. The second step was cooperating fully with law enforcement. Beverly had already contacted the State Employment Commission about potential violations of workplace safety regulations. She'd also reached out to the FBI's white-collar crime division after learning about Tony's broader scheme to help multiple employers frame their employees. On Friday afternoon, 2 federal agents arrived at the office to interview me about my experiences and collect evidence. Special Agent Rebecca Torres and Special Agent Michael Kim were both specialists in employment fraud cases, and they immediately understood the significance of what Mark and Tony had been doing. Agent Torres explained that employment drug testing was heavily regulated at the federal level because positive results could affect workers' eligibility for unemployment benefits, their ability to find new jobs, and even their freedom if parole or probation was involved. Systematically falsifying test results wasn't just fraud, it was a violation of civil rights that could destroy innocent people's lives. What you've uncovered, Agent Kim told me, appears to be a criminal enterprise that's been operating for several years. If Mr. Brennan has been helping multiple employers frame employees, we could be looking at dozens of victims who lost their jobs based on fabricated evidence. They were particularly interested in my recordings of Mark's admissions and the documentation I'd gathered about the timeline of events. Agent Torres said that having contemporaneous evidence was crucial for prosecuting these kinds of cases, since much of the criminal activity happened behind closed doors, where victims usually had no way to prove what had occurred. Most employment fraud cases come down to he said, she said disputes, she explained. Employers claim they followed proper procedures, and employees claim they were set up, but there's rarely concrete evidence either way. Your situation is different because you gathered proof in real time. The agents also wanted to understand how I'd figured out what was happening and why I'd been suspicious enough to start recording conversations. I walked them through Mark's escalating harassment, the suspicious timing of the drug test, and the red flags that had made me question whether the process was legitimate. You have excellent instincts, Agent Kim said. Most people in your situation would have accepted the fake results and quietly looked for another job. The fact that you investigated and fought back probably saved other people from being victimized. They spent several hours going through every detail of my interactions with Mark and Tony, creating a comprehensive timeline that would support criminal charges. They also collected copies of all my evidence, including the recordings, documentation of Mark's lies about receiving lab results, and the fabricated termination letter he'd prepared. Before leaving, Agent Torres gave me her business card and explained what would happen next. We'll be conducting a full investigation of Mr. Brennan's activities at MedScreen Labs. That will involve reviewing their computer systems, interviewing other employees, and analyzing their testing records going back several years. We'll also be looking at financial records to see if he received payments from employers for tampering with results. How long does that kind of investigation usually take? I asked. Several months, typically. But based on what you've provided, we already have enough evidence to arrest both Mr. Henderson and Mr. Brennan. The investigation will help us identify other victims and build a comprehensive case for prosecution. Agent Kim added that I might be called to testify before a federal grand jury if the case went to trial. Most defendants in situations like this end up pleading guilty rather than fighting charges with this much evidence against them. But if they decide to contest the charges, your testimony will be crucial. After the agents left, Beverly called an all-hands meeting to address the situation with the entire staff. She explained that Mark had been removed from operational responsibilities due to serious legal issues that were under federal investigation. She couldn't provide details about the specific charges, but she assured everyone that their jobs were secure and that the company was cooperating fully with authorities. "I know this is concerning and confusing," she told the assembled employees, "but I want you to understand that these issues involve Mark's personal conduct, not anything related to the company's normal operations or your job performance."
Sarah raised her hand. Is the company going to survive this? Should we be looking for other jobs? Beverly had clearly anticipated this question. The company's financial position is stable, and our client relationships remain strong. We're working with legal counsel to ensure that Mark's actions don't create ongoing liability issues. In the short term, we'll be operating under interim leadership while these matters are resolved. James asked about Mark's ownership of the company. If he's facing criminal charges, what happens to his stake in the business? That's being determined by our legal team. There are several possible outcomes, depending on how the criminal case proceeds. But I can tell you that arrangements are being made to ensure continuity of operations regardless of what happens with Mark's legal situation. After the meeting, several co-workers approached me privately to ask what had actually happened. Word had spread that I was somehow involved in Mark's removal, though most people didn't know the details. I explained what I could without compromising the ongoing investigation, focusing on the fact that Mark had attempted to fire me based on fabricated evidence. The reactions were interesting. Some people were shocked that Mark would go that far to get rid of an employee. Others admitted they'd suspected something was wrong with his management style, but hadn't known how to address it. A few mentioned specific incidents where Mark had treated them unfairly or taken credit for their work. I always wondered how Mark managed to come up with such detailed campaign strategies when he never seemed to do any actual research, Sarah said. Now I know he was just stealing our ideas and presenting them as his own. James nodded. The financial projections he'd present to clients were always suspiciously similar to analyses I'd prepare for internal use. I thought it was just coincidence, but maybe he was copying my work more systematically than I realized. It became clear that Mark's pattern of exploitation had affected most of the company's employees in one way or another. My situation was just the most extreme example of behavior that had been going on for years. Over the weekend, I tried to process everything that had happened and figure out what I wanted to do next. Technically, I was still employed at Henderson Marketing, though my job description and reporting structure were completely unclear given Mark's removal. The interim leadership team had assured me that I could continue working on my existing projects while they figured out longer-term arrangements. But I wasn't sure I wanted to stay at a company that was about to be at the center of a federal criminal investigation. Even if the legal issues were resolved favorably, the reputation damage could affect our ability to attract new clients or retain existing ones. It might be smarter to look for opportunities elsewhere before the situation became public knowledge. On the other hand, I felt a sense of loyalty to my coworkers who hadn't done anything wrong and were now dealing with the fallout from Mark's crimes. Sarah and James were good people who deserved to have their jobs protected. If I left immediately, it might destabilize the company further and hurt people who had supported me throughout this ordeal. I decided to give it a few weeks and see how things developed. If the company managed to stabilize and distance itself from Mark's actions, I might consider staying. If the legal complications became too overwhelming, I could always start looking for other positions. Monday morning brought news that resolved my uncertainty about staying. Beverly called me into her office first thing and told me that Mark had been arrested over the weekend. Federal agents executed search warrants at his home and Tony Brennan's residence on Saturday morning. Both men were taken into custody and charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of federal employment laws, and tampering with medical records. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. Part of me had wondered whether Mark's connections or legal resources might help him avoid serious consequences. Hearing that he was actually in federal custody made the whole situation feel more real and final. What about bail? Are they still in jail? Mark posted bail yesterday afternoon, but he's under strict pretrial supervision.
He's prohibited from contacting you, visiting the company premises, or interfering with the ongoing investigation. Tony is still in custody because he couldn't make bail. Beverly explained that the charges were serious federal felonies that could result in significant prison time if Mark and Tony were convicted. The conspiracy and fraud charges alone carried potential sentences of up to 10 years each, and the medical records tampering added additional penalties. The prosecutors are also investigating whether this was part of a larger criminal enterprise. If they can prove that Tony was running a systematic scheme to help multiple employers frame their workers, the charges could be upgraded to racketeering violations. That would mean even more severe penalties and the possibility that other people involved in the scheme could be charged as co-conspirators. Mark might find himself facing decades in prison rather than just a few years. There's something else you should know, Beverly continued. Mark's legal problems have created an opportunity for the company that we didn't expect. She explained that Henderson Marketing's largest client, Riverside Regional Medical Center, had been so impressed with my work on their campaign that they were considering a major expansion of our relationship. But they'd been hesitant to commit because they weren't confident in Mark's leadership capabilities. When they learned about Mark's removal and the criminal charges, they asked specifically whether you would be taking on a larger role in managing their account. They said they've been hoping to work more directly with you rather than through Mark. This was unexpected. I'd assumed that the criminal investigation would make clients nervous about continuing their relationships with Henderson Marketing. Instead, at least one major client was seeing Mark's removal as a positive development. What kind of larger role are they talking about? They want to designate you as their primary account manager and expand their digital marketing budget by about 300%. They're also considering bringing their traditional advertising work in-house with us instead of using their current agency. The numbers Beverly showed me were staggering. Instead of the $15,000 monthly retainer Riverside currently paid, they were proposing a $50,000 monthly commitment, with additional project fees that could easily double that amount. For a company Henderson Marketing's size, that would represent almost half of our total revenue. Obviously, taking on that level of responsibility would require a significant change in your role and compensation. The interim leadership team has been discussing promoting you to Director of Client Services with a salary increase and profit-sharing arrangement. I was still processing the magnitude of what she was proposing. 6 months ago, I'd been a mid-level marketing coordinator, struggling to get credit for my work. Now I was being offered a director-level position with one of the region's most prestigious clients specifically requesting my involvement. What about Mark's ownership of the company? How would this work if he's still technically the owner? Beverly had clearly anticipated this question. Mark's attorney has been in touch with our legal counsel about resolving his ownership stake. Given the criminal charges and the potential liability issues, he's motivated to reach a settlement that protects him from further legal exposure. What kind of settlement? He's proposing to sell his ownership stake to the employees through a structured buyout arrangement. The interim leadership team would form a partnership to purchase his shares, and employees would become owners of the company they work for. This was revolutionary. Instead of working for Mark's inherited business, we'd be working for ourselves as employee owners with direct stakes in the company's success. How would the buyout be financed? Primarily through the increased revenue from Riverside's expanded contract. The medical center has agreed to prepay 6 months of their new arrangement, which would provide most of the capital needed to buy out Mark's shares. The elegance of the solution was impressive. Mark's attempt to destroy my career had backfired so completely that it was now giving me the opportunity to become an owner of the company he'd tried to control through fraud and harassment. "What do you think?" Beverly asked. "Are you interested in staying and helping build something better than what Mark had created?" I thought about it for a moment. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it would also mean committing myself to a company that was still dealing with the fallout from criminal activity. There would be ongoing legal complications, potential negative publicity, and the challenge of rebuilding trust with clients and employees. On the other hand, this was a chance to help create the kind of workplace I'd always wanted to be part of. A place where employees were valued and respected, where good work was recognized and rewarded, where success was shared rather than hoarded by a single owner.
"I'm interested," I said, "but I'd want to make sure we're doing everything possible to distance the company from Mark's actions and create policies that prevent this kind of abuse from happening again." Beverly smiled. "That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say.
Part of your new role would involve developing employee protection policies and oversight procedures to ensure transparency in all our employment practices. We spent the next hour discussing the details of the proposed restructuring. The employee ownership plan would give each worker a stake proportional to their tenure and contribution level. I would receive the largest share after the founding partnership, reflecting my role in exposing Mark's crimes and securing the Riverside expansion. More importantly, the new structure would include checks and balances that made it impossible for any single person to abuse their authority the way Mark had. Financial decisions would require approval from the partnership. Employment actions would be subject to review by an employee committee. All business practices would be documented and transparent. We're essentially designing a company that's immune to the kind of problems Mark created, Beverly explained. It might be more complicated to operate, but it should be much more stable and fair for everyone involved. The employee buyout process moved surprisingly quickly. Mark's attorney was eager to resolve the ownership issues before his criminal trial, and the federal prosecutors supported the plan because it helped ensure that Henderson Marketing could continue operating and paying restitution if any was ordered. Within 3 weeks, we'd completed the legal paperwork to transfer ownership from Mark to the employee partnership. I found myself holding an ownership certificate for a company where I'd been just a mid-level employee a month earlier. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Without Mark's micromanagement and credit stealing, productivity increased significantly. Employees felt comfortable proposing new ideas and taking initiative on projects. Client relationships improved because they were dealing directly with the people who actually did the work rather than through Mark's filter. Sarah's graphic design work flourished once she didn't have to worry about Mark claiming her concepts as his own. James developed innovative financial tracking systems that helped clients understand their return on investment more clearly. Even our part-time receptionist started contributing ideas for improving customer service. The Riverside contract expansion became a model for how we wanted to work with all our clients. Instead of Mark's approach of overpromising and underdelivering while taking credit for others' work, we focused on honest communication, collaborative problem-solving, and transparent reporting of results. The medical center's marketing director told me during one of our weekly check-ins that working with us had become completely different from their previous experience. When we worked with Mark, it always felt like we were dealing with a salesperson who was trying to convince us that his ideas were brilliant. Now it feels like we're working with a team of experts who genuinely care about solving our problems. That feedback validated everything we were trying to build. We weren't just avoiding Mark's mistakes, we were creating something actively better than what had existed before. The criminal case against Mark and Tony proceeded on a parallel track while we rebuilt the company. In early October, about 6 weeks after their arrests, both men pleaded guilty to federal charges in exchange for reduced sentences and cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Agent Torres called me to explain the plea agreements and what they meant for the broader investigation. Mark pled guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and violation of employment laws. He'll serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. He's also agreed to pay restitution to you and any other victims we identify. What about Tony? Tony's situation is more complex because we've identified at least 12 other cases where he tampered with drug test results for different employers. He's pleading guilty to racketeering charges and will serve 4 years in federal prison. He's also providing information about employers who paid him to frame their workers. The scope of Tony's criminal enterprise was even larger than we've initially realized. Over the course of 3 years, he'd helped employers across multiple states terminate workers by falsifying their drug test results. Some cases involved individual employees who had filed complaints or threatened lawsuits. Others involved mass layoffs where employers wanted to avoid paying severance by claiming workers had violated drug-free workplace policies. The financial impact on victims has been substantial, Agent Kim told me during a follow-up interview. We've identified people who lost homes because they couldn't find new jobs after being fired for fake drug violations. Some lost custody of their children because the positive test results were used against them in family court proceedings. Hearing about the broader impact made me even more grateful that I'd fought back instead of accepting Mark's lies. If I'd just quietly moved on to another job, Tony's scheme would have continued destroying other people's lives indefinitely. The federal investigation also revealed interesting details about how Mark and Tony's conspiracy had developed. They'd reconnected at a college reunion about a year before my drug test, and Mark had complained about having problem employees he couldn't fire legally. Tony had bragged about his access to confidential medical records and his ability to manipulate test results. What started as a casual conversation between old friends had evolved into a criminal partnership where Mark paid Tony $2,000 for each employee he helped eliminate. The plan for my test had been their fourth collaboration, with previous victims at Henderson Marketing and other companies Tony had helped. Mark's other victims included an accountant who'd discovered financial irregularities, a sales manager who'd been outperforming Mark's targets, and a graphic designer who'd complained about sexual harassment, Agent Torres explained. In each case, they used fake drug test results to justify terminations that would have been difficult to defend otherwise. Learning about these other victims was sobering. I'd thought my situation was unique, but it was actually part of a pattern of systematic abuse that had been going on for months before I was targeted. The restitution process was complicated because calculating damages required understanding not just immediate financial losses, but long-term career impacts. For me, the calculation was relatively straightforward since I'd kept my job and actually received a promotion, but other victims had suffered years of unemployment, damaged credit, and destroyed professional reputations. Mark's financial situation was also complicated by the fact that selling his ownership stake in Henderson Marketing had provided him with significant assets, but most of that money was being used to pay legal fees and the employee buyout arrangement. The court ultimately ordered him to liquidate his remaining personal assets to pay restitution, which resulted in the sale of his house and most of his investments. Tony had fewer assets to liquidate, but the court ordered him to pay restitution from any future earnings after his release from prison. Given his criminal record and the loss of his professional license, that future earning capacity was likely to be limited. The resolution of the criminal case allowed Henderson Marketing to move forward with complete confidence that the legal issues were behind us. Mark's guilty plea eliminated any possibility that he could later claim innocence or try to regain control of the company. The federal investigation had thoroughly documented his crimes and cleared the company of any wrongdoing. 6 months after Mark's arrest, we'd successfully transitioned to full employee ownership and doubled our client base. The Riverside expansion had been so successful that other healthcare organizations in the region started requesting similar services. Our reputation for honest, collaborative work had spread through word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied clients. I found myself managing a team of 8 people and overseeing accounts worth more than $400,000 annually. The responsibility was significant, but it felt completely different from the pressure I'd experienced under Mark's management. Instead of being afraid of making mistakes or having my work stolen, I was excited about the possibilities for growth and innovation. The most rewarding part was mentoring newer employees and helping them develop their skills without fear of exploitation. We implemented transparent project attribution policies that ensured everyone received credit for their contributions. We created professional development programs that gave people real opportunities for advancement. We established clear communication channels that made it impossible for anyone to abuse their authority without accountability. During our first annual employee meeting as an independent company, Sarah stood up to address the group. A year ago, most of us were afraid to speak up about problems or propose new ideas because we knew Mark would either dismiss them or take credit for them. Now we're all owners of a company that values our contributions and rewards our success. Maya didn't just save her own job when she exposed Mark's crimes, she saved all of our careers. The applause was overwhelming, but I felt uncomfortable being characterized as a hero. I didn't set out to save anyone's career, I told the group. I just refused to accept being treated unfairly, and I was stubborn enough to fight back when someone tried to destroy my livelihood. That was the truth. I hadn't been trying to be brave or noble when I recorded Mark's conversations and gathered evidence of his fraud. I'd just been trying to protect myself from someone who was clearly willing to commit crimes to get rid of me. But the consequences of that decision had rippled far beyond my personal situation. Tony's arrest had ended a criminal scheme that had victimized at least 12 other people. Mark's removal had freed an entire company from an abusive management structure. The employee ownership transition had created a sustainable model for fair, transparent business practices. Sometimes, fighting back against workplace abuse does more than protect the immediate victim. Sometimes it exposes systematic problems that affect many people and creates opportunities for positive change that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal case provided additional validation that our decision to fight back had been the right choice. 3 of Tony's other victims filed successful wrongful termination suits against their former employers, recovering substantial damages for the career disruption they'd experienced. 2 employers who had paid Tony for fake test results faced federal investigation for systematic violation of employment laws. The financial impact on victims has been substantial, Agent Kim told me during a follow-up interview. We've identified people who lost homes because they couldn't find new jobs after being fired for fake drug violations. Some lost custody of their children because the positive test results were used against them in family court proceedings. Hearing about the
MedScreen Labs implemented comprehensive security reforms to prevent future tampering with test results, including multiple person verification protocols and enhanced digital tracking systems. The changes made it essentially impossible for a single employee to manipulate results without detection. Your case became a model for how employees can protect themselves from this kind of fraud, Agent Torres told me during our final interview for the investigation report. The evidence-gathering techniques you used and the way you worked with authorities has been incorporated into training materials for employment law investigators. That was gratifying to hear, though I hoped other people wouldn't have to go through similar experiences to learn these lessons. The ideal would be workplaces where employees didn't need to worry about being framed or exploited in the first place. 18 months after Mark's arrest, I received a letter from the Federal Probation Office informing me that he was being released from prison. The letter was routine notification required for crime victims, but it prompted me to think about how I felt about his punishment and rehabilitation. Honestly, I felt mostly indifferent. Mark had served his sentence and would face years of supervised release with restrictions on his employment and business activities. The criminal justice system had held him accountable for his crimes, and the civil restitution process had compensated his victims as much as possible. More importantly, the positive changes that had resulted from exposing his crimes were permanent and continuing to benefit people. Henderson Marketing was thriving as an employee-owned company. Other businesses had improved their employment practices to avoid similar problems. Tony's criminal scheme had been permanently shut down. Mark's personal redemption or rehabilitation was his own responsibility. My focus was on the future we'd built rather than the past we'd overcome. The most satisfying part of the entire experience was watching my coworkers flourish in an environment where their contributions were valued and protected. Sarah had been promoted to creative director and was leading innovative design projects that won industry recognition. James had become chief financial officer and developed financial management systems that other companies were asking to license. Our receptionist, who had started contributing customer service ideas during the transition, was now customer experience manager and had implemented client satisfaction programs that dramatically improved our retention rates. Everyone who had been held back by Mark's exploitative management style was now free to reach their full potential. 2 years after the whole ordeal began, I was invited to speak at a conference about workplace fraud and employee rights. The organizers wanted me to share my experience as an example of how workers could protect themselves from systematic abuse and exploitation. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of employment lawyers, HR professionals, and worker advocates, I thought about how much had changed since that first phone call from someone claiming to be Patricia Wong from MedScreen Labs. The most important thing I learned, I told the audience, is that workplace bullies and abusers count on their victims accepting mistreatment quietly. They design their schemes to make fighting back seem impossible or not worth the effort. But when employees refuse to be silenced and gather evidence systematically, even the most elaborate frauds can be exposed and defeated. I talked about the importance of documentation, the value of understanding legal protections, and the power of refusing to accept obvious lies just because they come from people in authority positions. Mark thought he could destroy my career with fake drug test results because he assumed I would accept his version of reality rather than investigating what had actually happened. That assumption was his biggest mistake, and it's the mistake that most workplace abusers make. They underestimate their victims' intelligence, determination, and ability to fight back effectively. The response from the audience was enthusiastic, with many people asking detailed questions about evidence-gathering techniques and legal strategies. Several attendees approached me afterward to share their own experiences with workplace fraud and abuse. One woman told me that my story had inspired her to report systematic wage theft at her company, leading to a federal investigation that recovered thousands of dollars in stolen wages.
A man explained how he'd used similar documentation techniques to expose safety violations that were putting workers at risk. Your example showed us that individual employees can successfully challenge powerful employers if they're smart about how they gather evidence and work with authorities, he said. That's a message that needs to be shared more widely. Driving home from the conference, I reflected on the unexpected trajectory my career had taken. 3 years ago, I'd been a frustrated marketing coordinator whose boss was stealing credit for my work. Now I was a company owner, a federal crime victim whose case had helped reform employment practices, and apparently a role model for other workers facing exploitation. The transformation hadn't been planned or anticipated. It had resulted from a series of decisions to refuse mistreatment, investigate suspicious behavior, and fight back against obvious injustice. Each individual choice had seemed reasonable and necessary at the time, but collectively, they'd led to outcomes I never could have imagined. Henderson Marketing continued to grow and prosper under employee ownership. We'd expanded to 15 full-time employees and were consistently ranked as one of the region's top marketing agencies. Our client retention rate was over 95%, and we had a waiting list of potential clients who wanted to work with us. More importantly, we'd created a workplace culture that actively prevented the kind of exploitation and abuse that had been routine under Mark's leadership. Transparent policies, shared decision-making, and equitable profit distribution ensured that success was shared rather than hoarded. The company had become proof that businesses could be both profitable and ethical, that treating employees' family wasn't just morally correct, but also commercially successful. Clients preferred working with organizations where they knew their projects were being handled by engaged, empowered professionals rather than exploited workers. 5 years after Mark's arrest, I received an unexpected email from him. He'd completed his prison sentence and supervised release and was working as a warehouse supervisor while completing community service requirements. The email was brief and formal, but appeared to be a genuine apology. Maya, I know this email might not be welcome, but I wanted to acknowledge that what I did to you was wrong and destructive. I've had a lot of time to think about my behavior and understand how my need to control everything led me to hurt people who deserve it. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused, and I'm grateful that you and the other employees were able to build something better from the wreckage I created. I read the email several times, trying to decide how I felt about it. The apology seemed sincere, and Mark appeared to understand that his actions had been fundamentally wrong rather than just poorly executed business decisions. But I also wasn't sure what response, if any, was appropriate. After thinking about it for a few days, I wrote back briefly. Mark, I appreciate you taking responsibility for what happened. The most important thing is that we were able to create positive outcomes from a difficult situation. I hope you're able to rebuild your life in a way that doesn't harm other people. It felt like the right balance between acknowledging his effort to make amends and maintaining appropriate boundaries. I didn't owe him forgiveness, but I could recognize his attempt at accountability without reopening old wounds. The email exchange made me realize how completely I'd moved beyond the trauma of his harassment and fraud. For the first few months after his arrest, I'd been angry about the stress and uncertainty he'd caused. But as Henderson Marketing had flourished and my career had thrived, those negative emotions had faded into irrelevance. Mark's crimes had actually created opportunities for positive change that might not have existed otherwise. His removal had freed the company from exploitative management practices. His arrest had exposed systematic fraud that was victimizing other workers. His prosecution had led to reforms that protected future employees from similar abuse. Sometimes, the best revenge against workplace bullies is building something better than what they tried to control and ensuring that their harmful behavior is permanently prevented. Today, 7 years after that first fake phone call about impossible drug test results, Henderson Marketing employs 32 people and has become one of the most respected agencies in our region. We've won multiple awards for both our client work and our employment practices. Most importantly, we've maintained our commitment to treating employees as valued partners rather than expendable resources. I serve as CEO of the company now, a role I was elected to by my fellow employee owners. The position comes with significant responsibility for guiding strategic decisions and maintaining the culture we've built together, but it also comes with accountability mechanisms that make it impossible for any single person to abuse their authority the way Mark did. Every new employee receives training about their rights and protections, including information about how to report concerns without fear of retaliation. We conduct regular anonymous surveys to identify potential problems before they escalate. We maintain transparent financial records so everyone can see how company resources are being used.
The policies we've implemented aren't just about preventing fraud or exploitation. They're about creating an environment where good people can do their best work without worrying about politics, manipulation, or abuse. They're about ensuring that success is earned through merit rather than inherited through family connections or maintained through criminal activity. When I speak at conferences or mentor other employees who are facing workplace challenges, I always emphasize that fighting back against abuse isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting everyone who comes after you and creating environments where harmful behavior is impossible to sustain. Mark Henderson tried to destroy my career with fake thread test results because he felt threatened by my competence and success. Instead, his criminal behavior exposed systematic problems that needed to be addressed and created opportunities for building something much better than what he tried to control. Sometimes, the people who try to tear you down end up providing the foundation for everything you build afterward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.